Evren sat quietly at the dinner table, the familiar clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation surrounding her. But her mind was elsewhere, bracing for the inevitable. Her father, seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat before turning his gaze on her. You know, Evren, I just don't understand what you're doing with your life. You're still stuck in that job of yours, working for that logistics company. Meanwhile, Nathan is making real money, building his empire. And Emma, well, she's always been the one who makes us proud. The words hit her like cold water. She could feel the heat of her cheeks burning, but she forced herself to remain composed, not allowing the sting to show. Her father's words were always the same, always laced with disappointment. Every family dinner seemed to come with an unsolicited reminder that Evren was falling short in their eyes. They never understood her choice, her decision to pursue a career she loved, to carve her own path without chasing what they deemed as success. To them, success was measured by wealth, power, and accolades. But to Evren, it was something different: stability, purpose, and a job that brought her a sense of fulfillment. Her older brother Nathan, with his shiny suits and expensive taste, had always been the golden child. He was the one who followed the family's idea of success, a rising star in the corporate world. And then there was Emma, the perfect daughter, married, with children, living a life that seemed tailor-made to their expectations. And then there was her, Evren, the one who had never quite fit in. I just don't get it, Evren, her father continued, his voice edged with frustration. You're so talented. Why aren't you doing something bigger, something that really matters? Look at Nathan and Emma. Why can't you be more like them? Evren felt the familiar ache in her chest, the sense of being the outsider, the disappointment she'd carried with her for so long. But tonight, something was different. She could feel the weight of his words, but instead of crumbling under them, she breathed in deeply and let them pass through her. She had spent years letting his criticism eat at her, feeling like a failure because she didn't fit into their mold. But not anymore. She had learned to silence the voices of doubt, the ones that whispered she wasn't enough, that her choices were wrong. She had learned to trust herself, to take pride in the work she did, work that might not come with the same outward signs of success, but that brought her a sense of purpose and integrity. Her role in the company, the systems she built, the trust she earned, these were her markers of success. Not the fame, not the riches, not the approval of her family. Maybe I'm just different, Evren finally spoke, her voice steady, though there was a fire inside her that she had long kept hidden. I don't need the same things you or Nathan or Emma do. My job gives me satisfaction. I'm proud of what I've built. I don't need to prove myself to anyone. And I'm okay with that. For a moment, there was silence at the table. Her father's eyes widened, surprise flashing across his face. This wasn't the Evren he was used to, meek, apologetic, always trying to prove herself. This was a different Evren, one who had stopped trying to fit herself into their narrow definition of success. As she met his gaze, something shifted inside her. She wasn't going to change who she was to please them. She was her own person now, strong, confident, and unapologetically herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Evren had always kept her life close to the chest, carefully guarding the truth behind the facade she wore. To her family, she was nothing more than a quiet, unassuming library assistant, someone who spent her days organizing books and cataloging archives, lost in the shadows of her more visible siblings. They never asked, never looked deeper. They didn't need to. It was easier for them to believe she had settled into a small, unremarkable life. Easier for them to think she had chosen a path of mediocrity, as if that would explain her lack of ambition, at least in their eyes. But the truth was far from the image they held of her. Beneath the calm exterior, Evren was running a financial empire, a billion-dollar empire that spanned across industries and borders. Pacific Horizon Trust, a name few recognized, was a juggernaut in the world of finance, and Evren was its silent queen. She owned the majority of its shares, and with them, a stake in dozens of companies that shaped the global economy. Her decisions, her strategies, had a ripple effect across markets, though her presence remained a mystery to most. No one knew the truth, not even her family. They never questioned her modest lifestyle, assuming that she had no desire for wealth or fame. Evren had perfected the art of blending into the background, of living under the radar, keeping her power hidden in plain sight. She had no need for the trappings of success that Nathan flaunted, or the socialite life that Emma reveled in. Instead, she found power in anonymity, content with being the quiet force behind the scenes. Her family saw her work in the library, and that was all they needed to see. She smiled politely when her father asked about her job, brushing off any deeper conversation with a well-timed joke or a deflection. "It's just the library, Dad. You know, organizing things and keeping order." They never asked about the finances that fueled her world, the investments she controlled, the deals that ran through her fingertips like invisible threads. They never thought to question why she had always been so secretive, so elusive about her day-to-day life. But Evren was a master of restraint. Her quiet demeanor wasn't just an act, it was a shield. She had learned long ago that her true power lay in staying out of the limelight. Her financial empire wasn't about the grand gestures or the public recognition. No, it was about control. Control of resources, of connections, of the invisible forces that shaped the financial world. She could move mountains with a single phone call, broker deals that could shift entire economies, and yet she chose to remain in the shadows. Her empire had grown over the years, not through ostentatious displays, but through careful, calculated decisions, made with an understanding of the global market that few possessed. She had used her intelligence, her quiet brilliance, to build something lasting, something untouchable. While her family flaunted their outward successes, Evren had built an empire that ran deep, far beyond the limits of their comprehension. At family dinners, when they talked about wealth, fame, and success, Evren would nod politely, keeping her thoughts to herself. The truth was, she had everything they wanted, but she would never reveal it. She didn't need their approval, nor did she care for the superficial trappings of success they prized so highly. What mattered to her was the quiet power she held, the power to shape the world, unseen and unacknowledged. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, when the weight of her empire pressed against her, she would wonder what it would be like if they knew the truth. Would they still look at her with the same judgment? Would they see her as the person she had become? Or would they still see her as the quiet, invisible Evren they had always known? And yet, she could never reveal it. Her empire was hers alone, a secret she would carry with her, hidden beneath the surface, forever. For years, Evren had endured the subtle but persistent disapproval of her family. It was a disapproval cloaked in concern, wrapped in dismissive comments, and delivered with the sharp edge of expectation. As a child, she had accepted it, assuming that their criticism was just part of the normal familial dynamics. But as she grew older, the weight of their judgments began to feel less like concern and more like a heavy, suffocating cloak that she could never shake off. The whispers behind her back, the knowing glances, the condescending remarks, they were all reminders that no matter what she achieved or how hard she tried, she would never be enough in their eyes. Her father, with his endless praise for her brothers, had always found her choices lacking. "Why can't you be more like them?" he'd ask, as though his sons were the only path to success. Her mother, ever the dutiful wife, would nod along, a silent accomplice in reinforcing the idea that Evren was not living up to her potential. Even her siblings, who were meant to be her allies, had failed her in their own ways, whether through indifference or outright rivalry. Evren had spent years trying to prove herself, working tirelessly to achieve the success she had always dreamed of, only to find her efforts met with indifference or outright belittlement. But now something had changed. Evren had crossed a threshold, one she never thought she would reach. She was no longer the girl who quietly accepted the weight of their judgments, no longer the woman who smiled through the hurt, pretending it didn't matter. She had amassed an influence that far exceeded anything her family could comprehend, and with it, the power to finally confront them. Her financial empire, built meticulously over the years, had given her not just wealth, but autonomy, an independence that no one could take from her. And now she had had enough. No longer would she shrink in the shadows of their expectations. No longer would she let their words define her. Evren was ready to face them with the truth. Truths about the work she had done, the mistakes they had made, and the years of sacrifice she had endured in silence. She sat at her desk, staring out of the window at the sprawling city below, the weight of her decision settling heavily in her chest. For the first time, she knew exactly what needed to be done. She would use her influence to hold them accountable. She would no longer allow them to hide behind their judgments, their assumptions, or their criticisms. With a deep breath, Evren picked up the phone. She had spent too many years as the family's invisible member, too many years watching her achievements go unnoticed. It was time for them to see who she had become, not just as a daughter or sister, but as a woman who had built something significant, something they had failed to understand, failed to appreciate. As the phone rang, her heart beat faster, but this time, it was not fear that gripped her. It was resolve. She would not let them dictate her worth any longer. This conversation would be different. She would no longer be the one apologizing, the one trying to prove herself. This time, it was them who would be forced to confront the truth. When her father's voice finally came through the line, she didn't hesitate. "Dad, it's time we had a real conversation. You need to understand what I've been doing, what I've built, and why I've chosen this path. I'm no longer the person you think I am. You need to face the truth about me, about what I've done, and about your own mistakes." The words were out, and there was no turning back. For the first time in her life, Evren felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had taken control. She had faced them, not with anger or resentment, but with the quiet confidence that only true power could bring. She would no longer let them define her. The game had changed, and this time, it was Evren who held the cards. The change didn't come overnight, but it was undeniable. For years, Evren had been the quiet, unappreciated member of the family. She had always stayed in the background, content with her own success, while her father, Nathan, and Emma basked in the spotlight. But when the family found themselves teetering on the edge of financial ruin, it was Evren who stepped forward, not with an air of superiority, but with quiet strength and a willingness to help. She didn't offer empty words or promises. She offered a solution, one that only she could provide. The financial crisis had come like a storm, unpredictable and merciless. Nathan, once the golden child, had made reckless business decisions that had brought the family to the brink of bankruptcy. Emma, caught up in her own life of social appearances, had overlooked the warning signs. Even their father, who had always prided himself on his ability to control everything, found himself powerless in the face of mounting debts. Evren had watched from the sidelines for far too long, the silent observer, as her family struggled. But when the situation became dire, she knew it was time to act. She didn't hesitate. She had built her empire over the years, and now it was time to use that power, not for her own gain, but to pull her family out of the abyss. With a single phone call, she restructured their finances, helping them navigate the complexities of debt consolidation, investments, and long-term planning. Her family had always seen her as distant, as someone who lived in a world apart from theirs. But now, they saw her in a new light. They began to realize the depth of her knowledge, the quiet brilliance that had always been there, hidden behind her modest exterior. It wasn't just her financial acumen that impressed them. It was her unwavering commitment to her family. She wasn't doing this for recognition, nor was she doing it to prove herself. She was doing it because, despite everything, they were still her family. As the weeks passed, the family slowly began to change. Nathan, who had always prided himself on his success, started to see the value in Evren's more measured approach to life and business. He began to understand that true success wasn't about flashy achievements or quick wins. It was about sustainability, responsibility, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. Emma, too, began to see things differently. She had always been focused on appearances, on living a life that impressed others. But Evren's quiet strength had shown her that real worth came not from external validation, but from inner fulfillment and meaningful connections. Emma began to shift her priorities, focusing more on building authentic relationships rather than striving for social approval. Even their father, who had always placed success in terms of wealth and status, started to understand that family came first. Evren had never been the type to demand recognition, but now he saw her not just as the daughter he had overlooked, but as a woman of integrity, wisdom, and strength. He began to realize that success wasn't just about money or prestige. It was about how you treated others, how you supported the people you loved, and how you found joy in the simple, meaningful moments of life. With time, the entire family began to change. They started to embrace the values Evren had quietly lived by for so many years: humility, integrity, and the understanding that true success was not measured by wealth or accolades, but by the ability to build something lasting, to support one another, and to find meaning in the relationships they had with each other. Evren had always been different from them, but now she wasn't just the outcast anymore. She was the one who had helped them see the truth that family was the greatest success of all, and that wealth, while important, was never the end goal. She had helped them redefine what it meant to be successful, and in doing so, had changed their lives forever. Evren had spent much of her life chasing a version of success that had been defined for her by others. As a young woman, she had believed that success meant wealth, recognition, and the ability to command the admiration of those around her. She had poured herself into building her financial empire, thinking that with each deal, each triumph, she was one step closer to proving her worth to the world and to her family. For so long, she had focused on the external markers of success: the amount of money she accumulated, the powerful positions she held, the silence of those who doubted her. But somewhere along the way, something began to shift. She realized that despite the accolades and the financial security, something was still missing. She had everything she thought she wanted: money, influence, independence. But she didn't feel complete. It was in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, that she started to question what true success really meant. It was during one of those moments of introspection, while helping her family through their financial crisis, that the answer came to her. True success, she realized, wasn't measured by the size of a bank account or the prestige of a title. It wasn't about being the most powerful person in the room or having the last word. True success was about the integrity with which you approached your work, the authenticity you brought to your relationships, and the way you made others feel. It was about doing what was right, not for praise or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Evren had built her empire, but in doing so, she had learned that the most valuable currency wasn't money. It was trust, respect, and the deep connections that were forged through kindness and understanding. Her work had always— the transformation wasn't instantaneous. It took time, patience, and a great deal of emotional resilience. But as the months passed, Evren began to see a subtle shift in her family. The same family that had once measured success by wealth, status, and outward achievement. They had always valued her success, but it was never in a way that made her feel truly seen. There had always been a barrier, a gulf between them, that money and accolades couldn't bridge. But now, as she looked around the dinner table, she saw something different, something she had longed for, but never quite believed was possible: genuine connection. The first signs were small but significant. Nathan, who had once seen his success as the only true measure of worth, began to open up about his own insecurities. He stopped bragging about his latest business venture and instead started to ask her questions about how she had managed to create a life that wasn't defined by external approval. He wanted to learn, to understand her in a way that went beyond admiration for her financial achievements. Emma, too, began to soften. The sharpness in her words dulled as she realized that Evren wasn't the distant, unapproachable figure she had once assumed. Evren's quiet strength had given her the space to see her sister not as a rival, but as a role model, a person who didn't need to chase after approval or validation from others, because she was already content in herself. But the most profound change was in their parents. Her father, who had always been a symbol of rigid success, had begun to understand what it truly meant to be successful. It wasn't about the deals he had closed or the properties he had acquired. It was about the relationships he had built, the love he had given, and the legacy of kindness and integrity he could leave behind. Evren's mother, who had always deferred to her husband, began to stand on her own, no longer just the quiet observer, but a voice in the family, one that carried weight and wisdom. They no longer viewed Evren as the outsider, the daughter whose quiet achievements didn't fit into their narrow definition of success. It wasn't easy for them. There were days when old habits crept back in, when they would fall into the comfortable rhythm of measuring each other's worth by career achievements or financial gain. But each time, Evren gently reminded them, not through words, but through her actions, that there was more to life than the numbers on a paycheck or the titles on a business card. She showed them that love, loyalty, and shared experiences were the true measures of success, and slowly it began to sink in. They learned to love each other without the need for condition, without trying to prove anything. The barbs of competition, the silent judgments, began to fade away. No longer did they measure their value by how much money they made or how many accolades they had accumulated. Instead, they began to find joy in the simplest moments: shared laughter, heartfelt conversations, and the quiet support they gave one another without asking for anything in return. Evren felt a deep sense of peace as she saw the family she had once longed to connect with finally understanding the meaning of unconditional love. There were no more expectations, no more demands for success that could never be fully met. Her family was learning to love her for who she truly was, not for her accomplishments, but for the person she had become. And in turn, Evren learned to love them in ways she hadn't thought possible. She no longer felt like an outsider, like someone who had to prove herself over and over again. She was finally accepted, not as a symbol of financial success, but as a daughter, a sister, a person worthy of love and respect. As she sat with them, feeling the warmth of their presence, she realized that this was the success she had been searching for all along. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about connection. It was about the ability to love and be loved, to forgive and be forgiven, and to grow together as a family. And for the first time in her life, Evren felt that she had everything she needed. Her family, once fractured and distant, was whole again, united by something far more valuable than any amount of money or success could ever provide: love.